Well, welcome to this special Easter-themed episode of QC Conversations. If you're brand new to the channel here, we are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And these conversations are really a chance to bring an expert onto the channel and to ask the questions that everyone is really thinking about and the questions that really matter. And today we have a fascinating episode lined up. Given that we're in the Easter season, I'm here in Australia, our guest is coming in from the US, we decided to pick up on the broad and important topic of the resurrection of Jesus. Just question, what are the odds that Jesus is alive? And to do this, I've brought on a philosopher, someone who specializes in probability theory and epistemology, and in a lot of the historical arguments for and against Christianity. And so, Timothy McGrew, it's fantastic to be able to bring you on the channel.
Thanks so much, Stan. Great to be here.
So cool. Well, mate, we are going to have, I guess, a long-form conversation around one of my favorite topics on the resurrection of Jesus. It's Easter season. People are thinking, what does this story mean? Is it myth? Is it history? Where does it fit in? But before we dive into that conversation, I thought it might be great just to give you a couple of minutes to spell out a bit of your story for our listeners and maybe a bit about what you do.
Yeah, so my story is really not all that dramatic compared to the stories that you'll hear some people tell. I don't have a vast tale of addiction and recovery or anything like that. I was raised in a wonderful Christian home by really good parents who lived out their faith 24/7. And I've come, as I've grown older myself, to appreciate more and more what a gift that was. But like many young people, I went through a phase in my late teens where I said, okay, now I have to find out for myself whether this is true. I've been told this by people that I respect and admire, but if it's not true, then that doesn't matter, right? So I began ransacking the library of the nearby Bible college where my father taught Greek and theology, and so I could be found on Friday nights up to my elbows in lexicons and trying to puzzle things out as the library was getting ready to close.
Usual Friday night activity.
Friday night way of spending your time. But in the course of doing that, I discovered the discipline of apologetics, and I discovered ways that it could be done that really spoke to me, where I said, okay, this is evidence as I understand evidence. This is the kind of thing that I can see as making a difference. Some of the arguments people put forward, they're kind of abstract and out there. I don't know if you've dared to venture out into the territory of something like the ontological argument. Never worked for me, but the historical evidence of that was something I could really sink my teeth into. And so that was when I became a confident Christian. Also, when I decided to go into philosophy, because in philosophy, we study skeptical objections all the way down to the ground. So I wanted to be able to give cogent answers, at least answers that would satisfy me and that I thought should satisfy other people, to all kinds of skeptical questions. So I went ahead and went into that for a discipline and got my degree in philosophy and became a professor working in the theory of knowledge. However, before everybody tunes out from your podcast, I will try to do this to the greatest extent possible with no equations.
Amazing.
So there we have it. Right.
I have to admit, when I'm reading...
The equations are there, but they will be kept in the background. We will serve the meal without also making you inspect the pots and the pans.
Amazing, because whenever I'm reading the philosophical papers, as soon as you start seeing modal logic come down in equation form, I'm like, I follow the reason, I follow the premises, but as soon as you translate that into letters, that makes it a little bit more difficult for me. So I appreciate you dumbing it down for us in that way. And it's really encouraging hearing a story as well, just about an upbringing and an environment that can encourage you to give space to your questions and to your doubts, and to make that meaningfully, but also just a loving, supportive environment where you see the real difference that God can make in people's lives. And that'd be my hope for our boys as they're growing up in our family, and I'm sure many others. So hopefully they'll have a story that, AKA you might say is boring, but is just one of blessing in a big way. This is philosophy, though, someone who comes more from becoming a Christian, studying theology has been my background. So languages, Greek and Hebrew, and but more in the theology side. I'm not a trained philosopher per se, though I try and do as much as I can to wrestle in that world. I imagine that at different times across your journey, since becoming a Christian, finding these historical evidences relatively compelling, and then in your field, there are moments of objections or arguments or even personal experiences that might provoke doubt. And as a philosopher, I'm wondering whether you had any profound experiences of doubt and what you've done through those moments.
I went through that period of doubt during those late teen years, so
Yeah.
late high school, early college, and that was painful in a couple of ways. It was painful socially, because when your peers don't understand what's happening to you and don't understand why you're so intent on trying to read all the writings of the bad guys, right? So I was reading the other side as well. I got the Atheist Debater's Handbook and the Case Against God and other books like that. And I'm reading right along in those, and that drove something of a wedge between me and some of my peers at the time, even though I wasn't endorsing what they were saying. I just felt that I needed to understand their case as they would make it themselves. Then, if I could come up with a good answer, I would know that I'd actually encountered the real thing and not some, fluffy straw man of it that could be easily burned down without touching the real intentions. I wanted to know what they were. So that was a tough period of time. After that point, I've had the mercy of being given a pretty tough sort of, how should I put this? A tough-minded disposition. So in philosophy, you don't really survive unless you're willing to hear other people vigorously disagreeing with you and just say, yep, okay, so I hear that you disagree. Now let's talk about the arguments. You can't allow yourself to be bulldozed, because philosophy is par excellence the discipline in which everybody disagrees about everything. So you just have to be kind of thick-skinned, as the expression goes. And so I found myself often thinking about objections, sometimes changing some aspects of what I believed, but it never really caused me, subsequent to that time in my teens, to doubt the core. The core seemed to me to be solid, and in fact, the more I learned, the more solid it seemed. And I discovered that what I thought was a pretty decent historical case that I had picked up on in my late years of high school, as we say here in the States, and early years of college, was only the proverbial tip of the iceberg. And there was so much more evidence that I had not even been aware of. And so that has rendered me a settled and grateful believer. And I can say, honestly, I have a satisfied mind. That's not to say that I don't have, the other kinds of things that Christians go through, the other kinds of struggles where I say, I'm a terrible person. I have so much to repent of. Why am I like this? And that's just a part of coming again and again and again to God and saying, this is how I'm always going to be whenever you leave me to myself, Lord. And that's a struggle, but it's not a doubt.
Yeah, it's a
the
different
other
dynamic.
kind of struggle, and the kind that I think lots of Christians go through, just practically speaking, right? Christianity is hard. Living it out is hard. If I'd been told at the outset
what it would take. No, you're right.
If I'd been told from the beginning, all right, now, you are signing up to walk in the footsteps of God incarnate, who is perfectly holy, I'd have had one of those Genesis 17 moments like Abram, where I just fell on my face, right? I mean, who would dare? If you understood, all right, this is what you're signing up for.
Yeah.
That is tremendously daunting.
Yeah, I've always appreciated C.S. Lewis's reflection on that. When he comes across the psychological critique of Christianity and they say, you only believe because you want it to be true. And he's like, man, if I was going to invent a religion, this would not be it. Because, yes, Jesus may hand me a psychological crutch of meaning or hope or forgiveness with one hand, but with the other, he gives me a cross and says, deny yourself, come and follow me. And so it's not exactly the one that you'd write up if you wanted to have an easy life. I'm curious, you mentioned the reflection on something like the ontological argument, so Aquinas logics God into existence, and a lot of people sort of struggle to comprehend the strength of that argument or just find it odd and abstract. What for you was perhaps the most persuasive argument to believe in the Christian story?
Right. So oddly enough, even though I'm a philosopher, it was not any philosophical argument. For me, it was the historical argument. Christianity is a religion that has at its core the claim that certain things happened in space and in time. You can investigate whether those things happened, and the results of your investigation matter. You don't just say, well, never mind, I have this burning in my bosom or something. No, you actually look at the facts and you try to see what is the best explanation for the facts that I
Yeah.
have. So the argument that really worked for me does center, as Paul tells us it should center, right, in 1 Corinthians 15, on the resurrection of Jesus. And I found that I was persuaded by the public evidence that it was true, that it had really happened. There's no shortage of objections to it, but the more I learned about those objections, the more I studied and read, the more it seemed to me that those objections really didn't affect the core of the case. They were either misguided directly or just sort of worried about issues that aren't at the heart of Christianity. There are a lot
Yeah,
of things that sincere Christians can worry about and think about and not be sure about. But the resurrection's not one of those. If you don't believe that Jesus rose from the grave, physically rose, then whatever you are, you're not a Christian. That's the heart of the good news. Without that, there isn't any good news. So it was the case for that really did it.
Yeah, well, I'm keen to dive into the meaning of that because, I mean, that's sort of Paul, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 makes that claim that this resurrection seems to be the hinge on which Christianity turns. If it didn't happen, it's a waste of time. Christians are idiots. They're full of false hope. If it did happen, then it's really substantial as a meaningful event. And, we cheekily titled this episode, given the fact that you deal with probability theory as a philosopher, you're an epistemologist, to put some real philosophical language behind it, sort of the study of the theory of knowledge. But the idea of what are the odds Jesus is alive? That's our cheeky episode title as we're going to dive into it. But before we look at the evidence itself and maybe see your particular argument laid out, I wanted to just question around the meaning of the Easter story. So a ton of people watch these videos. Some people are Christians, tenured Christians, been here around for a long time. Other people are brand new to the Christian story, maybe a little bit skeptical. And they're just wondering, I've never understood it, the whole Good Friday, the cross, the Easter Sunday, the resurrection. What are the meaning of these events? I'm curious to hear maybe a bit more from a personal angle on you. What is the meaning of the Easter story?
Yeah, so let's put it in the broader frame, right? The Christian story begins with the Jewish story. It begins with the Old Testament, where we're told that the world is broken. Things are not the way they were supposed to be. And part of what's broken is our relationship with our Creator. It's not just, though it is that we fall short of perfect holiness. Honestly, we fall short of imperfect holiness. We fall short even of the moral standards we profess to have. There's an internet meme I saw once that I really liked. It, a guy thinking, contemplating, saying, "Am I perfect? No. But am I trying in small ways every day to be just a little bit better? Also, no." We're not even trying. At least not even up to the standards that we would ourselves like to profess in our better moments. And that's bad news. If you believe that there is a God and you're not even living up to your own paltry standards of goodness, then you have a problem. And so Christianity resolves this by saying you can't get there from here, but he can. God can come down and dwell among us incarnate, and we can see him and follow him and understand him. And when he builds a bridge by his own death to say, this is where it all should have ended, but I'll take the penalty. And all that you have to do is to accept it in all sincerity of heart and to commit yourself to trying to live up to that, even though you know you're going to fail, you know you're going to have to repent over and over. That's the heart of it. Our relationship with God is broken, and now there's a way that's been made that repairs that. But you've got to put your trust in it. And now that's the trust thing is actually just the meaning of the word used in the New Testament. We translate faith. It's just trust. Trust can be well placed or it can be badly placed. And so what we want to know is this a trust, a faith founded on fact? Or is it just the baseless fabric of a vision? Is it just a cleverly devised tale, some kind of legend that we have bought into without really having historical underpinnings? And so that's why it actually matters what happened. That's why when we look at it, we're not just talking about a curious phenomenon. We're talking about the question of whether there's really been the grand repair of
Mhm.
our relationship with God. And if there hasn't, and we think there has, then we are deluded, and all of the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 come to haunt us, right? If Christ isn't raised, then your faith is in vain and you're still dead in your sins. And this repair of the connection to a holy God hasn't really been effected. But if it has been effected, then that changes everything, absolutely everything.
And that
Even
incredible
your
hope.
failures become meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah, of the reversal of death, just the finality of this experience of saying goodbye to
Yeah.
those whom we love and the tragedies that really do befall us. And you think, I was walking through this graveyard last year to actually just to record a video around last Easter, and these decaying tombstones and graves that are falling in, and this just sense of profound loss and the epithets that fill up those the face stones, and just thinking, is this it? Is this where we're all destined, or is there the hope that someday these tombs too can crack open and new life can spring
Right.
forth? And you just think, wow, this is a massive, life-altering, huge question. And so, yeah, like that ability to deal with the evil in the human heart and be made right with God, and then this profound hope. It's huge. Yeah, Tim, the
Yeah.
first time I came across your work actually in this area, I guess, it was on the video lecture that you gave online, just watching on YouTube, exploring the theme of Hume's problem of miracles. And this is a big one for a lot of internet skeptics. It's also just,
Sure.
I guess, a mood that a lot of people imbibe, that some of my friends who are just growing up more with the secular story don't really thought much about the God question. But you say Jesus rose from the dead, and they're like, seriously? Isn't our universal observation that dead people stay dead, doesn't that render this whole story to be implausible? So I remember you gave this really helpful analogy around understanding the regularity of nature and how that relates to the question of miracles, that it's not necessarily a problem, but almost necessary. I'd love you to maybe spell that out a little bit for those that are watching.
Sure. So again, just the big picture is Christians have been proclaiming for millennia that this is a miracle. And so we're not completely caught off guard when somebody says, but there's something a little bit odd about it. Yes, we know that there's something a little bit odd about it. That's the point, right? It's a miracle, because Christians are not saying dead men stay dead, except occasionally by some random fluke of nature, they don't. That wasn't the claim ever. No, the claim was, you're right about what nature can't do when left to itself. But this happened anyway, which means that nature was not left to itself.
Mm.
You've got something coming into the natural order, and you have to understand the natural order first before you realize, oh my, okay, this is now we're dealing with something that is really going to have great significance. If it's a fact, then it becomes a central fact, as you put it, sort of the hinge of the whole thing. Because if God wants to communicate with us, how could God announce his presence? By writing a wonderfully fascinating, profound book of philosophy? We already have people who do that. By writing lovely songs or great poetry? We have songwriters and poets. No, God's going to announce his presence by the act of sovereignty, by doing something that we can't do and that nature can't do. And the better we know ourselves and the better we know the natural world, the better we'll be placed to say, okay, that's not just a weird thing. That's not something that, quantum mechanics mumble, something. This is outside the scope of that. This is not something we can write off as a natural occurrence. So to do that, we have to be able to trust the accounts that we have, at least up to the point and the level of detail of saying, this is not just a natural phenomenon.
Mm.
And all of the alternative explanations are attempts to, in one way or another, dismiss the evidence as being, no. Dead men stay dead. And so Jesus must still have stayed dead. And so let's come up with whatever we're left with as an explanation for that. That's kind of the way that goes, right? We're going to try to come up with something. And the question is, will the evidence really allow us to do that and still claim that we're being fully rational and responsive and open to evidence? And I don't think it will. So that's the point at which I really want to say the evidence is the thing. And if we don't have it, well, the sooner we find out, the better. But if we do have it, then as you say, that changes everything, because what is promised here, what the story is telling us, is exactly the sort of thing that touches the point of our greatest need, and at the place of our greatest fear, right? That there's not some grander meaning in all this, that there isn't any forgiveness for sins, that this is all just this miserable little random blip of an existence carried out on the surface of a nondescript planet, and that when all is said and done, it just doesn't mean anything.
Mm.
That's the fear. And so Christianity offers hope, but we need to know whether that hope is founded on fact.
Yeah, and I really love that thought that you gave of the regularity of nature and our study of it now through modern science. It provides the backdrop, the contrast against which God's special message then, when he does want to reach in and do something different, can actually be received. That if we didn't understand how nature operates, we'd never be able to interpret when God is intervening in nature to be able to reveal himself. And so that wonderful witness in so many of the biblical stories, particularly around the birth of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, people understand how nature normally operates, the birds and the bees, and that's why they ask questions that are around, how can this be since I am a virgin, when Gabriel says to Mary, you're going to be with child, or the sense of, no, the resurrection really is difficult to grapple with and come to believe, and the doubts that even the disciples have as they're experiencing the presence of Jesus, all because, no, this really is something that is inexplicable simply by natural mechanism. And that's, the more we understand those mechanisms, the more we can identify where God is reaching in to do something different. And so I found that so helpful. And we have a short response on our channel, sort of a 7-minute video, Can You Rationally Believe in Miracles, that helps to respond to many of David Hume's claims. And as well, if anyone's interested to go and check that out, I don't want to spend too much time there. Because another challenge that we have is, even with Christian historians, let alone skeptical or just agnostic ones, they'll often say history cannot adjudicate on the question of Jesus's resurrection, because our methodology has to remain neutral on the question of miracles. And so we can't really say whether Jesus rose from the dead, because that would imply some kind of supernatural agency, which is outside our sort of ken as historians. What's your response to that notion that historians have to remain agnostic on that question?
If you are wrong, how are you going to find out? If you start out saying, I don't believe in miracles at the outset, and I am methodologically committed to never actually taking that as an explanation, and if you're mistaken, when should you change your mind? If you're not changing your mind as a response to the evidence, then how do you change it at all? And if you don't change it at all, isn't that itself a sign that there's a problem? Right? John Maynard Keynes, the economist, had a great line in a different context. He said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And it is a wonderful line, right? If the facts change, we need to be responsive to it. And if we've set up some kind of methodological principle that debars us from considering the best explanation of the facts, because that would have supernatural consequences, well, I guess I just want to say toughen up. If it does have supernatural consequences, then get with the program, right? Sure, ask your questions. Don't be a chump. Nobody wants to be a sucker. Nobody enters into this whole thing saying, I'd really like to be deluded. So, all right, ask your questions, be tough-minded, go for it. But the response of Christians throughout history has been, yes, we understand this is not what you would have expected if nature were left to itself. That's the point. Come and see.
I really liked what Andrew Loke said on this. I don't know if you've read his monograph on the resurrection, but he spells out at the beginning, he says, you actually don't even need to necessarily infer a miracle to explore whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Because let's imagine that there was some advanced alien civilization that had developed the Star Trek, Star Wars technology to be able to bring someone back from the dead. As a bit of a Stargate fan, they've got the sarcophagus from the Goa'uld, and they're able to put Jesus's body in there and resurrect him and then put him back in the tomb. There you've actually got a naturalistic explanation. You're not required by him dying and by him being alive afterwards to say necessarily that God supernaturally raised him from the dead. And actually by making that sort of an announcement, you said the historical question is, was he dead and was he alive again after his death? And that doesn't necessarily then say, commit you to the Christian explanation that God supernaturally raised Jesus from the dead, but it's still just a point of history. And I actually found that sort of helpful.
It doesn't commit you to it, logically speaking. On the other hand, once, if you become persuaded that this happened, the explanatory options are not all that wide, right? I mean,
agreed.
If at that point somebody's going to say, okay, aliens, that, I want to say, have you considered the entire history of the Jewish people? Have you considered the long arc of prophecy in which the heart of the whole thing is the Messiah? And the different layers of this as this becomes more specific, right? There's the promise in the proto-evangelium, and then there's the calling out of Abram, and then there's the refinement and the specificity, and Isaac and Jacob, and then David, and the promise that David's seed will sit on the throne of his father David, and it's all gets further and further refined and elaborated. And then you get Isaiah 53. And aliens, then? No, it looks like there's actually a consistent arc here.
Totally.
You have to make
Totally.
make the argument.
Jesus brings together all the pieces of the Christian story. I completely agree. Andrew Loke's point is only simply to challenge historians on this point. He says you don't have to be importing a miracle. It's simply the question historically, was Jesus dead? Was he alive again after his death? That's where the evidence points. You can say that historically without having to say God supernaturally raised him from the dead. And so I actually found that quite a helpful point to push back. It's like, what does the evidence say, rather than just allowing people that neutrality to sit back and say, well, we can't really say because. Well, no, that's not a fair
trying to get
inference.
around that prejudice.
Exactly.
I understand what you're saying. However, once you've gotten around it, if you do follow the argument to that point, I think that there are some inferences that are going to be rational to make.
Totally.
And so if we can get to that point and then we can talk about those, then I'm happy.
Well, let's do that. We've been stringing people along for a long time already. So let's jump in. I'd love to hear your version of the argument for the resurrection of Jesus, how you spell this out, because I know a lot of different Christians approach it from angles. There's the minimal facts approach that's been popularized by Mike Licona and Gary Habermas and even William Lane Craig to some kind of degree, a core facts argument. And then the maximal facts approach, which is trying to give a beefy view of the Gospels as our sources and the need for drawing in all of that material. So if you were to chat to one of my mates who's not a Christian and they're like, come on, you really want me to believe in this resurrection? Give me your best case. What would be your approach?
Sure. So first, let me just sketch it out in a couple of sentences.
Okay.
And then let's go back and dive into that. So here's the couple of sentence version of it. All right. The earliest Christians claimed that Jesus died by crucifixion, was buried, and came back from the grave and was seen by many. This is a claim they made. Now, either the claim is true or it's false. And if it's false, then either people promulgating it knew that it was false, in which case they're liars, or they didn't know that it was false, in which case they're dupes, they're deceived themselves. Now, the content of the claim makes it very, very difficult to go with an explanation that says, oh, they were just innocently mistaken about this. Because we're talking about somebody that was their intimate friend and master, and then we're saying they really didn't know, like, that he was dead. You're saying Romans didn't know how to kill a man. I'm sorry, that's a hard sell, right? Or are you saying they didn't really see him alive, but they just mistook somebody else for him? That's, again, So the content of the claim makes it hard for them to be innocently mistaken. The context of the proclamation, which they made right there, at Pentecost, makes it very unlikely that they were deliberately deceiving people, because what they got for their pains were labors and dangers and sufferings voluntarily undertaken, and new rules of conduct and a new manner of life. And that's just not something that you walk into for something that you are yourself aware is not the truth. So the content makes it hard for them to be innocently mistaken. The context makes it very improbable that they were deliberately deceiving people. And That leaves the third choice, which is the only one logically left over, right? Which is that what they said was true. Then the weight of the argument consists in addressing those two alternatives in greater detail and in making the case against various objections, which would tend to sort of rule out the possibility that it was true. So that's the short version. It's kind of a trilemma.
That's kind of a trilemma argument, yeah. And so, either Jesus was who he claimed to be and he really did rise from the dead and their testimony is true, or they themselves were deceived, or they're deceivers, and deceived whether intentionally by another agent or whether deluded by their own senses. There's sort of a couple of subtexts in there. But others would say, well, there's a step that you need to help me understand before we even get to the trilemma, which is sources. So you're talking about this testimony that Jesus's close friends and followers gave about his resurrection from the dead. Where do we get that from, and how do we know that this actually comes from those people?
Sure, and here's where the methodology that I prefer, and my wife and our good friend Jonathan McClatchy and others who are working in this vein, this is where we depart from anything like a minimal facts approach, because we go straight for the Gospels. And we argue that there are numerous marks of historical veracity in the Gospels. In some cases, those marks show up in actual accounts of miracles. In some cases, they show up elsewhere. But taken together, collectively, they show us a portrait of the Gospel authors as people who are close up to the facts and habitually truthful. When somebody writes a document like a memoir of a beloved rabbi, the author can't see 2,000 years into the future and say, people will be able to check up what I'm saying in this respect, so I better be especially careful here. But I can fudge it or put in some embellishment over there. They can't tell what you'll be able to test and what you won't be able to test. And it turns out that in numerous ways, internally and externally, we can cross-check these narratives. And when we do, they come up looking like extremely reliable history written by honest people close up to the facts. That's what we're looking for in sources. And the very fact that we have 4 Gospels, partly overlapping, partly not overlapping, allows us to look for a kind of interconnections between the accounts, not just the retelling of the same story in approximately the same words. That might just be due to some copying, literary copying, but places where unexpectedly one of the Gospels will provide the answer to some natural question that's raised when you're reading the other. And that's the argument from undesigned coincidences. And so that's something that's only one form of argument here, but that's been a really important piece that I think has been left out of a lot of people's apologetics training, even people who have degrees from, evangelical institutions that are teaching them apologetics. This is just a missing piece. They haven't been given a robust defense of the historicity of the Gospels. You can make that case, you can mount that case without either presupposing or necessarily concluding that the Gospels are inerrant or inspired. You just treat them like historical documents. But what you will come away with is the conviction that these are highly reliable documents. That's what we need. So when you say, all right, but where are you getting this stuff? We're going to go straight for the Gospels. We're not going to route everything through Paul, because we think that we have our best and most detailed accounts in the Gospels, and we think they stand up to that scrutiny. If we didn't, we wouldn't try to make the case that way. But I am persuaded by the public historical evidence that the Gospel authors really knew what they were talking about, and they were right up close against it. Do they have their own perspectives? Sure. Do they have things they are stressing, some of them that others are not stressing? Sure. That's not wiped out by this at all. But that's just life and history, right? It's when you start to cross-check things and cross-compare that you realize, all right, now, this is really interesting source material. There's other forms of argument as well. I don't know how much time we've got. I don't know how far you want to go into that. But
well, I love it. And I think there's a couple of points that are just helpful here to make, because one of the common lines of reasoning that people will hear is the first solid, I guess, historical source that we have on the sort of core teachings of what happened in the Easter story comes in 1 Corinthians 15, with the Apostle Paul quotes this early Christian creed that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared. And then it lists this litany of witnesses, and then an unusual witness, or one untimely born, because Paul had a different experience of Jesus' resurrection later. But what's interesting here, that's our earliest source 3 months to 5 years after Jesus' resurrection, this window into what the earliest Christians proclaimed. But obviously, you're right, the Gospels give us the fleshy details, the biographical details around these resurrection accounts. And we have 4 that are somewhat different. And in the normal reading of how the synoptic Gospels are, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'd find Mark often dated by the majority of scholars as the earliest, and then probably Matthew, and then Luke, and then it works upwards towards John being, much later, sort of between 20 to 60 years roughly is the timeline. And they'll say, okay, Paul, sketchy details, but it's very bare bones, just the death, the burial, the resurrection, the appearances. But now we've got these greater accounts. And look, Mark's gospel doesn't have in the original ending anything like post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Matthew's gospel does, but the disciples doubt. Luke's gospel has a much stronger account of Jesus, spelling out how he fits into all of history, and all the scriptures point to him. And then John's gospel has these elaborate dealing with Thomas and the other disciples, and the restoration of Peter and Mary Magdalene. And so they'll say it's legendary development. What would you say to that? Because I think there's just a couple of really important things to burst that bubble.
Yeah. So you can make something look like its development in a certain direction by cherry picking details, right? So you can say, oh, Mark doesn't actually have a detailed account of the resurrection. This is true. But if you start going through the Gospel of Mark, you realize that the author is very insistent on the fact that Jesus predicted his resurrection, right? Mark 8, Mark 9, Mark 10, you just start reading through these and you're like, over and over, he's telling the disciples, and he shall be crucified, and after 3 days he shall rise. Talking about the Son of Man, obviously referring to himself. So you can't really say, well, Mark sort of leaves off that whole resurrection bit. No, he's proclaiming it over and over and over. Right. Bruce Metzger, in his textual companion to the Greek New Testament, he says in a footnote there that it seems at least very plausible that the original ending of Mark, intended, possibly actually written, just has been lost, and that we don't have it. It's a hard sell to say that the gospel deliberately
finishes with the women.
The women, it says, because they were afraid.
Yeah.
That's not really an ending. So I think actually that this is a plausible thing that we just somehow
it got cut off, and then the copies never had it attached yet.
Right. Well, some copies then fill it in, right? So we've got the long ending of Mark, from which the authorized version, the King James version, does verses 9 through 20 of Mark 16, and that, I think, that does look like somebody was trying to fill in a gap because they felt the need for it. But I mean, consider what Bart Ehrman tries to say, that, Jesus becomes progressively more and more in control. In Mark, he dies without really knowing what's happening. Well, okay, again, go read Mark 8 and Mark 9 and Mark 10, and you see that Jesus knew what was happening. But it's only in John, which is, I think, reasonably dated as the last of the Gospels to be written, that you have the most human of all of the statements of Jesus from the cross. I thirst. And someone comes in, offers him something to drink, right? I mean, that's the most human statement, showing the most weakness of a kind I can connect with of all of them, but it's in the last one. So this whole idea of cherry picking a few things and saying, oh, okay, now we've got a trajectory, now we know that they lined up in this way, I think it doesn't really hold up to a close examination of what the Gospels actually contain.
And there's a
I
real
would like
counter
to,
narrative in that too,
yeah,
because you get to 1 Corinthians 15 and the litany of witnesses that it describes are the people that are impressive, right? They're the male disciples, they're the leaders of the early church, they're the authorities that people are looking to. And if that's the earlier source, circa mid 50s, and then you're wanting to claim that the Gospels added these stories to write Jesus into real history, and so why import then the witnesses being women, that the first discoverers of the empty tomb and these, if the most elaborate first eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection was Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel.
right.
It just does not make any sense that they're writing these stories in after the fact. And the
Why
details
would
are
you
not
do that?
necessarily
Right.
more complex because it's, the embarrassing features idea of the Gospel.
Mhm.
These are not things that are helping you sell it as religious propaganda. They're undermining its credibility in the ancient world. And so
In
you
fact,
just
the
think
Roman
there's so
historian,
many problems.
yeah. So the Roman skeptic Celsus actually picked up on exactly that in his book, The True Word, and he said, "You have just followed the rantings of some hysterical women." He tries to pick up on exactly that and write it off. And
You'd
you
get
would have
cancelled
had
for
to
that
have
today for
known that you
sure.
were given a handle for that, right? So why would you do that?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and so I think it's helpful to people that when you hear these ideas, it's just legendary development, is to think through that clearly in line with the evidence. It's like, well, no, Mark's gospel has 3 women, Matthew's gospel has 2, Luke's gospel has the women, multiple, and then John's gospel focuses in on Mary. It's not getting more and more complex. You're just having spotlighted different details from different groups. And so how would you deal with the charge someone like Bart Ehrman would make around the contradictory nature of the 4 gospels? If the gospels are so central to establishing the credibility of these resurrection appearances, is it a problem that they have differences amongst the resurrection accounts?
So 2 things. First of all, when we have multiple stories of any interesting, complex historical event, we often find places where we don't see at a first or maybe even a second reading how to reconcile all of the claims that are made. There's a funny one out of the history of the American presidency. One of our 20th century presidents, about a century ago, Calvin Coolidge, gave out a message for the newspapers. So they all filed in, and without saying anything, Calvin Coolidge, who was famously not a verbal guy, handed each reporter a slip of paper, and same thing on each slip of paper. And then they went out and they filed their reports, and we have these reports from the newspapers. Well, you start looking at the newspaper again. He was sitting, he was standing, very grim and serious.
Sure.
A trace of a smile about his lips. They disagree on these things. Now, reading this, we can say, all right, maybe he was sitting when they first filed it, and then he stood up to hand it to them. Maybe he was very solemn with one man, but had a little twinkle in his eye for somebody else. We can reconcile it. We can harmonize it. But the fact is, the bear reports are more obviously difficult to reconcile than many of the things Bart complains about in the Gospels. So we have to calibrate our expectations. What does real reportage look like? Once you do that, if you read, say, Jesus Interrupted, and you read his chapter on a world of contradictions, he's got between 40 and 50 things he claims are contradictions. And I think of them, maybe 4 or 5 will survive a first reading of the texts for yourselves, right? Once you get to that point, then you can say, all right, a few other ones that are a little trickier, a little more interesting, wonder what can be said on behalf of one or the other of those. But you don't get wholesale unreliability unless you really do have this great cataract of contradictions that Bart claims. And once you start looking into it, most of those just disappear. And the residual ones, hey, we can have a good discussion, and maybe I'll come up with something I think is the case, and you'll say, I don't think that's quite good enough, and that's fine. But now we're just arguing around the edges of it, and the substantial historicity is not challenged by that.
Yeah. And the fact that we have 4 accounts that aren't verbatim the same, like you said, which would just show literary dependence. There's one source, the others have copied, that you've got different traditions emerging, different eyewitness testimony that independently has, like you said, those details that can be cross-checked, that history of reliability against the data of the first century. Like, that's significant. That's significant. Yeah. So I just think it was important to spend a little bit of time exploring that question of the sources, both with Paul and then with the Gospels. And there are broad sketches from early church fathers, other Christian sources, and then extra Christian sources or non-Christian sources from the pagan world that at least give reference to what the Christians claimed around Jesus's death and resurrection and some of that. But that's where we go, the Gospels and the letters of Paul, really for our data. So spend a bit of time there. I'm curious, for those people that are thinking around Jesus's, okay, they had some experiences. They discovered an empty tomb. What are some of the alternative explanations then for their genuine belief that he'd been risen from the dead?
So if you're going to insist that he didn't rise from the dead, then you have to have something. One of them would be, nobody ever said any of this. The documents aren't even remotely trustworthy. You can't take anything that they said and go anywhere with it. And for that, I think the arguments that we've just been discussing, filled out in detail and pursued in detail, are a good counter to that. But that's one way to go. Another way to go would be to say they made it all up. They stole the body. The tomb was in fact empty, but that's just because the disciples or some subset of the disciples ran in and stole the body and made off with it. And the problem with that, as I said, is the context of intense persecution that was brought to bear, which you could have foreseen, right? Jesus' death had just been procured by the Jewish rulers at the hands of the Roman governor. They were in cooperation in having him crucified. How do you think they're going to react to the claim that he rose from the dead? Of course, that's just going to bring down the hammer again. So that's, you can try to say that, but that's really hard. You can try to say they wigged out and thought that they were seeing Jesus when they really weren't. But collective, detailed hallucinations are just not a thing like that. You can get some vague sort of crowd synergy going with some vague things. Hey, do you kind of see some lights up there? I don't know. Maybe I see some lights up there. But we're talking about their rabbi. I like to ask people, like, did you have a good friend back in your school days, somebody that you used to hang out with? Can you remember some day that you hung out with that person? Do you think that you could honestly swear that during that entire day, it was really your friend and not somebody else, and that your friend was alive and not dead? So maybe this is my way of getting back to that point Andrew Loke was making. Look, these are just matters of fact. And we all think we're competent to identify our friends and to say whether they're alive or dead. So trying to gin up some kind of cognitive dissonance theory that's supposed to cover the detailed accounts that we have, if those accounts can be substantiated, and that's the other part of the argument, that's fine, then psychologically that is just wildly implausible.
One of the things I found really helpful in this was N.T. Wright, so another UK New Testament scholar, exploring the context of the time period, Second Temple Judaism. What were the popular Jewish beliefs at the time? And so let's say the disciples did have a desire to steal Jesus' body and concoct a story, or let's say they had experiences that were hallucinations. Neither one of those would have them arrive at something like the resurrection of their Messiah in the middle of history. Right? And so the popular Jewish belief of the notion that Jesus would rise at the end of time, of the great resurrection, everyone would stand judgment, that there is one resurrection in history, the notion that someone would defeat death and would come back in a body that cannot die, would begin this breath of new creation already. That's just not a category that was open to them at the time. And so it's a novel theological belief that you just wouldn't have them saying. They had categories for spiritual beings. They had categories for people who were dead, but you could call up their spirit, like what happens with Saul and Samuel in the Old Testament. And so the notion of what they saw, then saying, oh no, he's been physically raised from the dead bodily. And to make this argument and to spell it out, it's just not plausible that would be what they would invent in response to it. And I found that a really interesting line of argumentation. I'm not sure what you think on that.
Yeah, no, I think actually that's sound. If you wanted to make it up and you were a devout Jew, and all of the earliest Christians were Jews, if you wanted to make up something and say, no, this has continuity with everything that we have known from the scriptures that we have up to this point, you would make up something quite different. And if your brain had been working overtime on it, then that's the natural direction we would expect your brain to do it if you were going to wind up self-deluded. So
Yeah.
neither the deliberate crafting of some story nor the arising of this as a response to the stress of seeing their rabbi crucified really gives you any predictive power for the kind of thing that came out, which was, well, I mean, you've got Peter saying in Acts 17, right? I mean, he showed himself alive to us. This is not, he ate and drank with us. This is not just something where they're claiming vaguely, somehow they're sure in their hearts Jesus is alive.
Yeah.
It's very specific. And again, in a context of persecution, it is a hard sell to say, all right, we're going to make very, very specific claims. And they're going to get people really ticked off. Why would you do that? Why would you make those claims? And why would you make up those claims?
And that theme of the costliness of their testimony, their willingness to stake not just this life, and we have good historical evidence. I mean, Sean McDowell's work on the fate of the apostles with his dissertation, just exploring, there's a handful of apostles that we have a good reason to believe were martyred for the faith. The others certainly suffered social isolation from the Jewish community. They faced, little spotted persecution from the Roman authorities, imprisonment and beatings, all sorts of things. They obviously suffered and were willing to suffer in this life. And that thought, raised in Orthodox Jewish faith, the concept of calling a man God, of misidentifying Yahweh as a human being, of then the charge of blasphemy and what that would mean for them to stand before God in judgment. So the stakes are so high on their testimony to make sure that they were convinced that it was right. And you just start to weigh up these various features and you're like, wow, this does seem to be genuine, trustworthy, moral transformation, significant testimony. And I'm curious. So you often hear from, you go.
I was just going to say, can I just do a devil's advocacy thing on one more point?
Yeah.
Right? So you can say, we can say, well, it looks like it's very improbable that they were lying, very improbable that they were deluded or deceived themselves. But then somebody can come along and say, yeah, but still in all, isn't it kind of improbable that someone would rise from the dead?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was going to ask, mate, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That great line from Carl Sagan. So, the title of this episode, what are the odds Jesus is alive? And you start off with this sense of, okay, you want me to believe, Dan and Tim, that there is one guy 2,000 years ago that rose from the dead, when we've observed that people don't rise from the dead. This is, to begin with, you want me to believe in a particular miraculous explanation. God raised Jesus from the dead. This is how. Surely that is incredibly improbable on its face. At the beginning, this whole idea of prior probability. How is this enough evidence to be able to actually believe a claim like this?
Here's what I'm going to say. If you have the wrong view of what the evidence gives you as a probability, you're going to find yourself locked outside of any possibility of changing your mind. And that's
Pause that out for us. Pause that out for us, because I think for a lot of people, we're just not familiar with doing probability calculations. So
So here's a kind of a very quick and dirty version of Hume's argument. Human testimony is sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But the very fact that we call something a scientific law means that this is the kind of thing that we don't think there are any exceptions to at all. So you've got one kind of evidence that is kind of patchy, and you've got another kind that is as good as it gets. Which way are you going to go? Obviously, if it's an arm wrestling contest, we're going to go with the evidence for the laws of nature. That's just the way it seems. But this is it's a subtle slide that he's done. He's kind of moved us from one thing to another without advertising. The laws of nature don't tell us whether anything interferes ever with the natural order. They tell us how the natural order behaves when nothing is interfering with it. Dead men stay dead. Virgins are not simultaneously pregnant, right? That's the natural order. So it'll tell you what happens when nature is left to itself. It will not give you the same probability that it has been left to itself. I do think you should require more evidence for the claim that a man rose from the dead than that he rose from his bed. right? I mean, you got up at before 4 o'clock a.m. your time this morning, and that's a little unusual, but I'll take it on your word for it. If somebody claimed, hey, you know what, Dan rose from the grave this morning, if I determined that they meant it as more than a metaphor, I'd want more evidence. Fine, good. That challenge, well, but do you have good evidence for this rather striking claim? Yes, we do. I'm ready to meet that one. But if you place it beyond the reach of evidence altogether by just saying, oh, come on, no, laws of nature always win that contest, then you've just got the wrong concept of the laws of nature. And then we can't even change our minds. And that ought itself to be a clue that something's gone wrong with this whole argument.
Yeah, I like that idea. Just really simply put, if God exists, then miracles are possible. And so the question is there good evidence to believe that God wants to reach in and make himself known in this particular circumstance? And that's why I think something like the religious significance of Jesus of Nazareth is such a big factor in this conversation. And we're not just talking about God raising some random person from the dead that has no bearing. You've got someone who has claimed to be the fulfillment of all that God has revealed through Israel. He lives this life of a singular moral caliber. He's got this profound moral genius in his teaching. He has claimed this ministry of miracles that even his opponents wanted to have him condemned. The Jewish Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, speaks of Jesus being condemned for magic and for blasphemy. So no one's questioning whether he was a miracle worker or a doer of wonderful deeds, to quote the potentially adapted Josephus line. But then you've just got this claim of him predicting his resurrection, his death and resurrection, him fulfilling all of those predictions, some of which completely unintentionally and unable to affect. It's like, no, if there was ever going to be a religiously significant moment for God to reach in and give this rubber stamp of approval on anything, it's going to be the resurrection of Jesus as the vindication that he does bring all of the Christian story together. And so that just seems to me such a, like you said originally, the alien civilization. Yeah, look, I don't think Scotty's beaming Jesus up, resurrecting him and then putting him back down. It seems to be that the broader story, the plausibility of God's existence and the religious significance of Jesus all fits this explanation that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Right.
Does that seem fair? And I guess
the direction I would go. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
if anyone, if there are some people watching this that are a bit more interested in probability theory, and particularly how you do Bayes' theorem calculations, prior probability, God's existence, the story where this fits, but then the specific evidence as well, and how the calculus changes. You don't want to set scientific odds against historical reality. It just seems to be a unwise way of doing things. I've just benefited so much from your lectures on that online. So jump on and check out Tim's work on YouTube. Tim, if you did want people to find out more of your work, maybe particularly what you and your wife get up to, Lydia, who's a brilliant thinker, philosopher, and emerging voice within the realm of New Testament sort of studies as well, just with her own defenses of the Gospels, particularly, and some of these arguments we spoke about. Where might people go to track down more of the McGrews?
Right. So for my work, you could go to a couple of places. There's an article on miracles at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, secular outlet, that I am responsible for. So you can see the case fleshed out with many alternative ideas considered and different definitions and all that stuff, and even a little touch of mathematics, which I will not quote because I promise not to drive all of your listeners away.
You're a good man.
And also, Lydia and I have co-authored an article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And it's an article on the argument for miracles. And that goes into a lot more of the mathematical details. So, maybe it should come with a little health warning on it. If you're allergic to mathematics, bring your epinephrine pen or whatever you need to stab it into yourself if you feel yourself being overwhelmed. But it's, there's that. And then I have started a website, which my friend Sarah Enterline also helps me to maintain and expand. That's the Library of Historical Apologetics, historicalapologetics.org. And some of the older sources there that have fascinating material are available for free download. There is no piracy involved here. This is all public domain material. You can download it, you can share it freely. And we're working on indexing it, and we're still near the beginning of the alphabet, but we're gradually making our way through. I think we're up to like the letter F or so now. So it takes a long time because we have over 1,000 sources that we are putting up there for everybody to download, but we're working on it. So you could check that out. My wife, Lydia, in addition to the 4 books that she's put out on this subject, the first one, Hidden in Plain View, deals with those undesigned coincidences. This most recent one, just out this month, Testimonies to the Truth, is a coverage of a bunch of different lines of argument, all converging. And so if you want a case for the trustworthiness of the Gospels that goes together with what we were talking about, that would be a place to go. Also, she's got a YouTube channel, just Lydia McGrew is her YouTube channel. And so that would be a good place for you to go to get some more of her materials. She has a public Facebook page, Lydia McGrew Author, and she puts content up there sometimes as well, so you're welcome to follow that. So those are some places that people can go. Jonathan McClatchy, good friend of ours, has been building out a lot of this argument as well. Jonathan's fully on board with what we have coined the term the maximal data approach, and so a lot of Jonathan's work is really good and is out there. Lots of web articles that you can download and read on these topics as well.
Super helpful. And I've found some of the historical apologetics, coming back to sort of even times around the dawn of the Enlightenments, but figures like William Paley, who, that argument that Lydia's really developed from the undesigned coincidences, sort of rediscovering some of the work that he was doing. And so our chronological snobbery that what we have today is always best just misses some gems that people have done in the past in this area. So really, really appreciate all of that. If there was someone watching, it's Easter season at the time of this recording, and a newcomer might be stumbling upon this and said, I've never really looked into this much, but they're potentially considering Christianity. Would you have any parting message to someone who's inquiring?
Yeah, it matters what you find out. Keep looking into it. Look into it. Even if you're not sure of it, keep on examining, keep on asking your questions, and don't rest until your mind is satisfied. If you want to talk about it, there's a website, talkaboutdoubts.com, where you can request a conversation with an expert, whatever your particular questions are. This is, again, an organization that my friend Jonathan has set up, and I'm an active participant in that. And we talk to high school students and pastors who are losing their faith and everybody in between. And it's just a free service we provide. There's no charge for it. If you'd like to ask specific questions and get actual answers and not just some fancy shuffling, we'll do our best. And if we don't know the answer, we won't bluff.
It's so good, actually. So a couple of my good mates are part of that here in Australia. Luke Barnes, who is obviously big in the area of cosmology and fine-tuning, and then David Dean, who works with me here at Questioning Christianity. He's a bit of a rocket scientist working with Lockheed Martin, but really diving into a lot of theology and historical apologetics as well. And so it's a wonderful opportunity. Please do avail yourself of that. And as Tim shared at the very beginning, the resurrection of Jesus, it is unbelievable in its implications, both for this life and the reanimation of meaning and purpose in a relationship with God here, but also for the world to come, and the whole pursuit through transhumanism and technology to try and find a way to stave off death. All 2,000 years ago, Jesus gave us one with his resurrection from the dead and the promise of eternal life to whosoever believes. And so wonderful that you can join us today, Tim. Really appreciated taking the time from over there in the US, and richest blessings from all of us here in Australia as you and the family celebrate the Easter season. Hope to have you on the channel another time. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Dan.
No worries. Well, if this was your first time on our channel here at Questioning Christianity, please do like and subscribe. We also have a ton of shorthand content. We had a brand new video just released, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead, just in time for Easter. Check that out. We've got a couple of spoken word videos on the Good Friday story, Why Did Jesus Die? And Is Jesus Alive for Easter Sunday? Maybe devotionally to dive into as you celebrate Easter. But otherwise, check out what we have across our social media channels, different ways to connect with a bunch of material, hopefully be helpful for you. Until next time, though, truth invites questioning. See you later. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.